Third world countries were simply the countries that refused to pick a side. It had nothing to do with poverty. It wasn't a label for poor nations, and it was never about broken roads, poor facilities, or bad government. But somewhere along the way, that meaning got hijacked. And today, most people don't even know the original definition. Because when someone hears third world, they don't think politics. They think poverty. They think suffering. They think broken systems and hopeless futures. And that misunderstanding has quietly shaped how we see entire nations, and even ourselves. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. If America is truly a first world country, why do millions of Americans live paycheck to paycheck? Why are people constantly stressed about rent, food, healthcare, and bills every single month? Why does survival feel like a full-time job in the richest country on earth? And if China was once labeled third world for decades, how did it become one of the strongest economic powers on the planet? Something isn't adding up. So let's rewind all the way back and expose what these labels really meant before they were turned into insults. Because third world never actually meant poor. It was never about money. It was never about development. It was about politics. During the Cold War, the world was split into three broad camps. The first world referred to countries aligned with the United States and Western allies, capitalist economies, democratic systems, NATO countries, Western Europe, Japan, Australia. The second world referred to countries aligned with the Soviet Union, communist systems, state-controlled economies, Eastern Europe, the USSR, its satellite states. And then there was the third world. Not poor countries, not undeveloped countries, just countries that refused to pick a side. They didn't want to answer to Washington, they didn't want to answer to Moscow. They wanted sovereignty. That's it. No money requirement, no living standard test, no ranking system, just neutrality. That's why so many countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East were labeled third world, not because they were struggling, but because they chose independence over allegiance. India, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Ghana, they weren't aligned with either superpower, so they became third world. But here's where history plays a trick on us. Most of those neutral countries also happen to be former colonies. Centuries of extraction, borders drawn by outsiders, economies designed to benefit Europe, not local populations. So when colonial powers left, these nations started their modern journey already behind. Not because they were incapable, but because they were recovering. Meanwhile, the first world countries were already industrialized, already wealthy, already stable. And slowly, very slowly, the political label of third world began to morph into an economic insult. First world started meaning rich, advanced, modern. Third world started meaning underdeveloped, unstable, broken. Even today, people casually say things like, "This place feels third world," or "That's third world behavior," without realizing the term was never meant to describe quality of life at all. But here's the part most people never hear. The labels were always messy, always flawed, always oversimplified, because real countries don't fit neat boxes. Saudi Arabia was considered third world politically because it wasn't aligned with either Cold War bloc, yet it became one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Cuba and North Korea were considered second world, aligned with the Soviet Union, but economically, many people there live with conditions more similar to what we call third world. Some European countries stayed neutral during the Cold War, never joined NATO, never joined the Soviet bloc, and yet remained rich, stable, and highly developed the entire time. So what does that tell us? The labels were never accurate descriptions of reality. They were shortcuts, simplifications, political branding. And branding has consequences. Because once a country is labeled third world, the world treats it differently. less investment, less trust, lower expectations. And sometimes the country itself starts to believe the label. Now let's talk about China. For decades, China was called Third World, not because it was neutral forever, but because it wasn't aligned with the Western capitalist system. And yes, China was poor for a long time, but the label didn't predict what came next. Through industrial policy, infrastructure investment, manufacturing, and long-term planning, China transformed itself. Same country, same people, different system. Today, it competes with the United States economically, technologically, and geopolitically. So clearly, Third World was never destiny. Which brings us back to the most uncomfortable question of all: America. If America is First World, why do life feel so fragile for so many people? Why does one medical emergency wipe out savings? Why does rent rise faster than wages? Why is student debt treated like a life sentence? Why does survival feel like a full-time job in the richest country on earth? Because here's the truth most people don't want to admit. National wealth does not equal personal wealth. America produces enormous amounts of money, trillions of dollars, massive corporations, record profits. But that wealth doesn't flow evenly. Costs rise faster than incomes. Housing becomes a speculative asset instead of shelter. Healthcare becomes a luxury instead of a right. So even in the richest country on earth, millions of people live with constant financial anxiety. Not because the country is poor, but because the system distributes wealth unevenly. That's why someone can live in a first world country and still experience what feels like a third world struggle. And that's why experts today avoid using the term third world entirely, because it doesn't explain reality anymore. Instead, they use terms like developing countries, least developed countries, or global south. Not because those terms are perfect, but because they at least acknowledge complexity. Because the real divide today isn't East versus West. It's not first versus third. It's access. Access to opportunity. Access to stability. Access to dignity. You can live in a rich country and feel poor. You can live in a poorer country and feel secure. So maybe the real question isn't which country is rich. Maybe the real question is who actually gets to feel rich? Who gets to feel safe? Who gets to plan for the future? Who gets to breathe? Because if you're living in the wealthiest nation on earth, working non-stop, still barely surviving, then what does being first world even mean anymore? And maybe, just maybe, the most dangerous myth of all is believing that a label tells the whole story. Before you go, kindly subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. Your support really helps this channel grow. Don't just watch and disappear, be part of the conversation. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next video coming tomorrow.